Hello everyone and welcome. Let's talk about online events and putting your storytelling and your interpretation online today, because I think if there's anything we have learned from the previous year and a half, it has been how to use the online format, live or not live, more and more, and how to try and convert storytelling from what was once in a museum or in an exhibition or in a heritage site and try to transfer it to some sort of online setting. Now, there are so many different formats and setups for this, depending on what you are doing, especially for events or activities. But I thought let's try and focus on the sort of classical traditional webinar today, how to host that, how to host a talk or a presentation, what you do as the facilitator or the host, what to look out for as well, how to be inclusive still in your storytelling, and how to essentially put focus on some really interesting stories, histories, sometimes historical characters. As always, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and add your comments on how you go about this. Let's just have a quick look at some of the different formats and setups. As I said, there are so many different ways of going about this, and you will have found your own, and there are many different ways also for inclusiveness and participation and doing events with more activities essentially. But if we look at the more sort of traditional live lecture or talk, you can have the sort of normal setup you would normally have if you are hosting events online. You can do a Q&A, or maybe you don't have a Q&A, maybe you have a presentation online, a PowerPoint, simple PowerPoint online. You can also have a live conversation, meaning, for example, with an external person, an expert you might have invited, and it can be a conversation between you, the host, and them, or perhaps between two experts in the same field. And again, you can have a Q&A or a chat or some sort of interaction with attendees or participants. This can also be panel talks or group discussions where you have several people in and one host coordinating the discussion. This will of course require a bit of a different sort of very structured setup, because obviously you can't have many people talking over each other, but be very clear about who is talking when and how much time people have to talk. You can also do live demonstrations or interactions with again, Q&As or comments or polls going on, perhaps printed handouts or prints that have been provided in advance where visitors can have them ready, or participants, attendees can have them ready, sitting at home, perhaps being ready to do something and engage in activities and demonstrations. There's so many different types and formats and setups here, so it's very easy to find combinations of all of the above as well. And as I said, I'm pretty sure you will have found your own way around this as well. But if we try and dive into what is actually your role, what you need to focus on when you are hosting or when you are facilitating an online webinar, live talk, or a live conversation. First of all, agree on the detailed setup. So the timekeeping, how much time do we have available to do the different things? The hosting, the interaction, is there, for example, to be a Q&A? Is it possible to ask questions in the chat? Or how do you go about this? Agree on the participants, the presentations, for example. Is someone going to record this and edit it as a live event and put it online later on? Is there subtitles available, and so on and so on. So really agree on the different things in the format, and especially around the timekeeping. When is what happening? How much time do you have for a Q&A, for example? Also, rehearse and practice questions, especially if you have a talk. If you have a webinar consisting of, let's say, a talk, maybe half an hour, followed by Q&A. What sort of questions might we anticipate? What do we do if we get some negative comments? It might happen. Are there certain things that we are not going to talk about or mention or go into? And again, this is actually something that happens very often, especially with contemporary issues. There might be political issues or ethical issues and so on that you simply don't want to focus on, and have that agreed between you. What are we not getting into here? Be very specific when you introduce, when you welcome visitors or attendees, participants, whatever you want to call them, to the webinar, to the live online event. Go through the practicalities. For example, is this being recorded? What is going to happen when? Let attendees know about the format. How long do we have together tonight? What's the structure? Is there going to be a Q&A? Can I pose questions? Will this be recorded so that I can watch it later on, or perhaps refer friends and so on to it? So be very specific about what's going to happen, just like you would do at a live event. People like to know what's going to happen and when. Prepare a few questions in advance, especially when you're dealing with a live Q&A, because it takes time for people to type. So you can't just sit there in awkward silence. So have some questions prepared. Also, this will help you steer the conversation. If there are certain topics within a talk, for example, that you want to make sure that you cover and you come across, have some questions prepared as well. This is also something that can be quite nice for the speaker or speakers, if they know that, okay, we will definitely touch upon these topics within the Q&A as well, so I can actually have some answers prepared here. When you read out questions in a chat or a Q&A, be approximately 5 to 10 seconds ahead all the time, because you want to know the questions before you start reading them out and before you start bringing them up, either because you want to tie them in with something that the speaker might have talked about already, or perhaps because you want to link it to certain things that have already been mentioned. Also, as a previous note said, if there are any rude comments or any negative comments, you might be able to filter these out if you don't want to include them, if you're just a little bit ahead. Remember to smile, to nod, to be an active listener. People can see you, and you are part of a panel or part of a hosting panel, so you are very much on even when you are not talking. Of course, you can look down, you can look at notes at the chat and so on, just like you would in a normal live event, but remember to be an active listener. Try to follow the conversation and the questions and the directions. Now, I'm mentioning this because this is actually quite difficult sometimes. Now, when you are trying to be ahead with the Q&A and trying to read ahead on the questions, you at the same time have to listen to where the conversation is going, especially if you are hosting an event with lots of speakers. They might interrupt each other or talk over each other or add things to what the other part just said. To what the other person just said. So make sure that you try to follow where's the conversation going, in which direction are some of the questions going, for example. Is there a specific thing that people want to know more about than other parts of this? So be prepared for unknown directions and try to work within the agreed setup and structure. Have a positive exit speech ready, a bit like you have prepared an introduction. Remember to thank the relevant people, to mention where attendees can find more information, refer to websites or links, mention if you have any surveys or questionnaires, or if there are feedback options ready. Thank people for joining in. Thank them for their time, for joining you, just like you would when you're hosting any kind of normal live event as well. But have an exit speech prepared in the same way you would have an introduction prepared. Hosting online events, webinars, talks and so on can actually be something you need to rehearse and practice, just as when you're being host on live events, because it is a very different format and it can feel very different, because very often you can't really see the attendees or who's there. You might be able to see how many is there and you get some names up on a list, but you don't really interact with them in the same way because you can't see how they react to it. If they're interested, you can't look them in the eye. You can, of course, try to judge whether or not there is a lot of activity going on in the chat, but even that can sometimes be difficult, because I have hosted events where the speaker has been so interesting that there hasn't really been much going on in the chat anyway, because people were so absorbed and busy listening and following perhaps a presentation and images and so on the screen, that they kind of forgot a little bit about the chat. So that's not always indicating whether or not people are hooked on a topic or on a speech or not. So it can be really hard to tell. just how much people enjoyed this. Of course, you can have a little indication going on when it comes to the number of attendees. Are people dropping off? Do you keep the number up? Are people staying there for the duration of the talk? That's usually a really good indication of whether or not something is captivating and going well. But it can be really hard, this format, if you are used to seeing people and looking at people and looking around a room and looking people in the eye to judge whether or not they're actually enjoying this. So it's a little bit of a strange format sometimes, but a good thing is mixing it up with presentation, include photos, images if you can, make sure that we see the speakers from time to time on the screen. Make sure you are an active listener as well when you're hosting, when you're asking questions. Make sure to have questions prepared. Don't be afraid of sometimes silence or pauses. That gives attendees a chance to just listen as well and just collect their thoughts as well. But of course, make sure that you know where we're going next. Are we looking at a question from a person who's listening? Are we looking at one of your questions? Do we have a follow-up question? Do you have a follow-up question yourself, and so on? And of course, the timekeeping. There's a lot to keep an eye on here, but it's a really, really interesting format. And I think it's something that will be explored in so many different ways in the future. So I'm really interested to hear about some of the things you have tried online when it comes to either transferring storytelling and interpretation online, doing webinars, hosting events and so on. What has worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? How have you gone about this? What's your approach to this? Please add your comments. It would be so interesting to share some experiences on this.